Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining this online representation of the Bigger, Better, More Joined Up presentation. I've been giving this talk to a number of villages and towns around Ashdown Forest to explain the project that we've engaged in with our partners and neighbours. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for your time. I'm going to take you through a short historical context to give the background to Ashdown Forest and what we have to manage today and some of the problems we encounter as a result. I'm then going to talk about the context in which Bigger, Better and More Joined Up is being pursued through government's landscape recovery scheme. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we hope to achieve and how we hope to achieve it over the coming years. So let's start with a little historical context. As many of you will know, Ashdown Forest was created by the Normans as a hunting forest. Now, clearly there was a great deal of history before this, during the Roman period, the iron mining period, the Saxon period, but I'm focusing on the Norman period because it created, in many respects, the forest that the conservators of Ashdown Forest are responsible today. So let's start off by thinking about the name. Names are important, words are important. And Ashdown Forest's name creates many of the management questions that we have to grapple with today. Now, some people believe that the word Ashdown is a combination of two Saxon words, the word for the ash tree and the word for hill. Now, I think that we'll agree that Ashdown Forest is quite a hilly location, but many people point out that there are not many ash trees and there never really were. So other historians suggest that actually Ashdown Forest's name comes from the name of an individual. The truth is that we don't know, there is no proof either way, and we never will. But nonetheless, we are Ashdown Forest. But why are we Ashdown Forest? As many people point out, many of the important values of Ashdown Forest are associated with places without trees. Much of our landscape has very few trees. So why are we called a forest? This is important because it relates to many of the management decisions that we take. Well, the reason is that in this context, the word forest is not referring to a wooded area with many trees. It's referring to the word forest, which is a Latin word that comes to us through the Old French of the Normans. And forest in this context means outside. And this is a reference to the fact that the forest area was outside the usual laws that pertain to the rest of the land. Special laws were relevant to this area. And this relates again directly to the fact that the area was a hunting forest of the Normans. So it had a legally different kind of structure and management. And that is the reason why many of the Norman hunting forests, such as Epping Forest or the New Forest, have this word. It doesn't relate to woodland or trees. It remains to the kind of legal management of the area as a hunting area. Now, the word Ashdown, however it is derived, was first recorded in writing in a document signed by this gentleman, Henry I, who was giving permission to monks from Lewis to use a road that crossed this area. That was the first written reference. After that, there were many similar words, all a bit confusing. What was the name of this location? They're all related to Ashdown, but you can see, rather confusing. This gentleman, the Duke of Lancaster, thought he would cut through the confusion. He looks like a man who's not easily confused. He would solve the problem of the name simply by calling it after himself, which he did. And for some time, this area was known as Lancaster Great Park. But in time, it reverted to Ashdown as it is today. Now, history is an important context in which we work, And these are a number of key historical events over the centuries that give rise to the Ashdown forest that we know today. Now, I'm going to focus on the enclosures of 1693 because these, which were primarily directed towards selling off areas of private land, of common land, excuse me, selling off areas of common land to make it private for the breeding of rabbits. Now, we know that this was for the breeding of rabbits because so many of the lands that we are part of this area today are called warrens: Hindleap Warren, Broadstone Warren, Crowber Warren, and others. These are all references to the breeding of rabbits. And this map, I think, is particularly interesting because you can see the areas that were sold off, the names of the individuals, and many of these names are still within our landscape today. And the boundaries that you can see established in this map conform almost completely to the boundaries of what we know today as Ashdown Forest. Now, if anybody was trying to design a landscape to be managed for whatever purpose, really they wouldn't create one that looked like this, what I call a ragged ring around the empty heart of private land. This makes no sense from a management point of view, but it was created to meet the purposes of the day. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the context of this idea of bigger, better, and more joined up. And these four words all relate to the reality that nature and species, plants and animals, both move and need to move around the landscape. Now, climate change is creating an even greater tendency for species to move. And this, if those species are to be retained, needs to be facilitated by joining up land. These movements have serious impacts on the species, on the ecosystems, and human well-being. They're not new. When I first left England in 1981 to become conservation worker, I went to Africa and was very delighted to discover these three species of beautiful white egrets. I'd never seen them before. They were entirely new to me, but I was unaware that as I was moving around Africa in the early 80s, these species were beginning to move around the UK. They were moving north and moving into new territories as a result of climate change. And these three species are all now well established in the United Kingdom. Other species too are on the move. In particular, damselflies and dragonflies. We've received over 10 new species in the last decades. This species arrived just 13 years ago, the southern migrant hawker. In those 13 years, this species has already colonized significant parts of southern England, and we can expect this range to expand as the climate warms. Another species of particular concern to many is this Asian hornet. This has arrived in the Kent and Sussex area in the last couple of years. Government is concerned that it could devastate our honey production industry, but this is a predator of many insects, not just bees, and there are real concerns that it could have significant impact on our insect and other species. We've been talking about species that have arrived recently in response to climate change, but nature has always been on the move. This species, the collared dove, arrived in this country only in the 1950s, having spread rapidly across Europe. Prior to that, its range was located to the far east. Nobody really knows why it started moving and moving so rapidly, but it reached Britain in the 1950s and has now colonized almost the entire area of these islands. So nature needs to move always has moved and is moving more and more in response to climate change, this needs to be facilitated. Their movement needs to be facilitated by joining lands so that nature can move through it. Now we come to the core of this discussion. These 4 words come from a report written by Sir John Lawton, commissioned by government in 2010. Now, it was a long report, but the author said that the important elements of it could be summarized in 4 words. If we want to make space for nature, we need to have more land, it needs to be bigger, better, and joined. Now, how do these 4 words deliver better conservation? Well, better simply means better managed. So if you have an area of land, such as Ashdown Forest, there are management activities that you can undertake to improve the land for nature and biodiversity. On Ashdown Forest, these are 2 activities we undertake. Constructing leaky dams. Here's a volunteer working on a leaky dam, which improves our wetlands, which are very important for particular species of biodiversity. And we also make scrapes. We open up the bare soil because bare soil is critical for certain species. So we can improve the area that we are managing to make it more accessible to more species of biodiversity. So it's better managed. Now, more and bigger are both relevant terms. They're similar terms in some respects. Bigger is naturally better. The more land you have for conservation, the more nature you'll be able to protect and conserve. More is slightly more complicated and refers to the fact that certain species of biodiversity such as these snails, can exist in sometimes very, very small areas. So on the left, we have pictures of Wookey Hole in the southwest of this country. In the center, we have landscapes of China. These are very particular habitats and can have species restricted to a cave or restricted to a hill. And if you want to conserve them, you need to have more areas under your conservation management. Joined is perhaps the most important of these words, certainly in the context that we're talking about today. We have a popular understanding that islands are locations of enormous biodiversity, full and rich with nature. There are examples where this is the case, and that's why perhaps we have this understanding. These turtles and this finch are from the Galapagos Islands, which have extraordinary biodiversity and stimulated Charles Darwin to start thinking about how evolution worked. But in general, islands are more like this. And the clue is in the joke. It's a very small island, and the man on the tree can see nothing but the oceans surrounding. These are both reasons why there's very little biodiversity on this island, because bigger and joined creates more diversity, whereas smaller and less joined gives less biodiversity. This was an understanding established in the 1960s through the science of island biogeography, which explains quite simply that if you are a small island, very isolated from a source of new species such as the mainland, you would have fewer species than a large island that was closer to the mainland. And this is because a large island will retain more species because it's bigger and there's more nature on that island, more capacity and possibilities for species to survive. And it's easy for new species to reach that island. And the converse is true for small, distant islands. This is important when thinking about Ashdown Forest, because Ashdown Forest can be thought of as a small island surrounded by a sea of incompatible land uses. This understanding and this recognition has stimulated a number of organizations and individuals to think about how they can join up areas to promote and support the conservation of biodiversity. This is the Wheeled to Waves Corridors, a partnership which Ashdown Forest is proud to be a part of, that is looking at joining up areas of land through corridors to allow nature to move and thrive. Others are working on the same idea. The Centre for Large Landscape Conservation, the director of which came to Ashdown Forest to talk to us, has been creating a landscape for the last 20 years that runs from the Yellowstone National Park in America all the way to Alaska and the Yukon. And this corridor is over 2,000 miles long. It's being very successful in joining up areas that wildlife can move between. Now, here on Ashdown Forest, what can we do to avoid the consequences of our small size and our isolation within often intensively farmed landscapes? Well, quite simply, we can get bigger by planning our activities with our neighbours. We can get better at delivering conservation by working together with our neighbours to design activities that work across our lands. And finally, we can join up simply by joining our lands with our neighbours and managing them together. And this is what we at Ashdown Forest with our neighbours are hoping and planning to do. Now, we are responding to a new programme that has been set up by government called the Landscape Recovery Scheme. And before we move on to discuss that, let's look a little bit at why we need to think in terms of recovery, because although many of us are happy to live in a green and beautiful land, which we believe is full of nature and biodiversity, in fact, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. This is the most recent report that confirms this fact about the United Kingdom. Now, many of us are now very aware of the threats posed by climate change. Less of us are aware of the real threats posed by the biodiversity collapse and the loss of species and nature. Now, I don't raise this in order to spread alarm, but to create the context of why government is looking at these issues and thinking about landscape recovery. Last year, our government made a commitment to put 30% of our land area and 30% of our waters into nature management and nature protection by the year 2030. This is a very significant undertaking. It is a very important commitment that has been made, and it needs to be delivered on. One of the key tools that government has developed to deliver on this commitment is called ELMS, which is not a reference to the beautiful elm tree, so many of which we've lost in recent decades, but it stands for Environmental Land Management Scheme. Now, the Environmental Land Management Scheme is taking a different approach to how government interacts with the owners and managers of land, and in particular farmers, but also including organisations like Ashdown Forest. Historically, government subsidy has been given to land managers directly in relation to the production. So if you have a given number of cows or sheep, you will receive a given level of subsidy. If you're growing a given level of arable crop, you will receive a given amount of subsidy. Government is now saying, no, we need to rethink this. We need to give public money for public goods. And in this context, public goods means the recovery and restoration of nature across our landscape. Now, this creates an opportunity which Ashdown Forest and our neighbours are keen to benefit from. And in order to do that, we are in the process of creating what we refer to as the larger Ashdown Landscape Recovery Project. Once again, you may ask, why are we on Ashdown Forest talking about recovery? We have magnificent nature, we have beautiful wildlife, we have some extremely rare species. These photos are of the honey buzzard, the Dartford warbler, of the raft spider, and the adder. All of these species are either rare or very rare, and Ashdown Forest provides an important landscape for them. So we have valuable landscape, we have biodiversity, we have beautiful biodiversity within Ashdown Forest. But this is the opening of a report we commissioned last year, which points out very clearly that notwithstanding the beauty of our nature and the wonderful species we have lost so much biodiversity that few of us are even aware. And this is why we need to think in terms of nature recovery, even on a protected area like Ashdown Forest. Now, we've looked at this map before. This is the landscape bequeathed to the conservators of Ashdown Forest and the public by the enclosures of 1693. What we are working with our neighbours to achieve is something that looks more like this. The blue circle is around Ashdown Forest, but now you can see that the empty heart, the empty neck, has now been largely filled in as we work in partnership with the owners of those lands. Ashdown Forest is now working closely with the managers of Hindley Warren, of Broadstone Warren, and Pippingford Estate, but also many other landowners. We are a total of 43 working together from Gravetie Estate in the west all the way across to Broadstone Warren Nature Reserve in the east. This is a significant undertaking and has the capacity and potential to deliver landscape management across an area of nearly 7,500 hectares. Now, we are responding to an opportunity created by government through the Landscape Recovery Scheme to create 50 landscape projects across the UK. And they have set aside funding to help these develop because they're quite complex structures, they're quite complex partnerships. And we are working with our neighbours to access both this funding and the ideas and support that government is offering so that we can put together a proposal, a project for landscape recovery that will receive government and private funding over a 20 to 30 year period. By working with DEFRA, we hope to significantly increase the stability and sustainability of both the farming systems and the conservation of nature in this large landscape. Now, there are a number of elements that we really need to focus on in order to deliver this project. These have been identified by government, but responded to by us. And these are the ecological, social, financial, and legal elements of this large landscape project. Although no doubt some of you will be interested in the financial and legal aspects, today we are focusing on the ecological and social aspects. We have already begun, and we have begun by working together with many of our neighbours. We're learning together, study tours, and we're planning together, already looking at how our lands can be combined. And this combining of our lands is in order to improve connectivity, another way of talking about being joined up across the landscape. Now, we're very fortunate in this area of the UK that we have many hedges and hedgerows. These are incredibly important to allow the movement of biodiversity. They already exist, and it would be our intention to manage them not in this way, where their value is reduced as their size is reduced, but to encourage hedgerows to become larger and more complex, and therefore provide homes for more biodiversity and corridors for biodiversity to move through. We also will be looking at how these hedgerows can connect with themselves, with each other, to create a network of connections and channels and corridors for wildlife to move through the larger landscape, joining up woodlands. And we see no reason why we should not share the idea of infrastructure bridges. The United Kingdom is rather behind the curve in the development of this kind of infrastructure for nature and people to improve connectivity across the landscape. But this is a project that is being built not far from here to bridge across the M25 at the Wisley Junction. And if that can be done at the Wisley Junction, we believe that it could, for example, be done across the A22 to improve connectivity across our landscape. And this is part of our thinking and will be part of our design moving forward. Now, grazing, those of you that know Ashdown Forest will be aware that we use grazing animals very extensively to support the delivery of nature conservation on our heathlands. And here we have Exmoor ponies, Hebridean sheep, and Rigate Galloway cattle, all of which play different roles in supporting and protecting the special biodiversity of heathland. But these species can also be used and play important roles in other habitats, including wetlands and woodlands. Now, we have these species and we wish to use them more extensively across the landscape by working with our partners and neighbours. Some of us would be very keen to see this beautiful creature, the European bison, return to our landscape. It has, after all, been returned to a landscape near here in Kent. The truth is, I believe that we will not see this creature in the Ashdown Forest, the larger Ashdown Forest landscape, anytime soon, but that does not mean it will never happen. And these animals play very significant roles in creating opportunities for biodiversity to move and thrive in our heathlands and our woodlands. These two species, the pine marten at the bottom left-hand corner and the water roll on the top right-hand corner, are both species that thrived in this landscape until, in the case of the pine marten, persecution led to their local extinction, and in the case of the water vole, water quality and the presence of mink have led it to become almost extinct. We believe it's hanging on in a few corners of our larger landscape, but we wish to work together with our neighbours to bring these species back and allow them to thrive. And indeed, there is an active plan moving forward to bring the pine marten back into our landscape through reintroduction by 2026, which is a very exciting prospect. Many of our neighbours, and we here on Ashdown Forest, would be very excited to see the return of beavers to our rivers and streams. The beaver has very dramatic impacts on our wetlands and on the movement of water that can have incredibly important positive results for biodiversity, but can also have very positive results for people by managing water more effectively using this kind of green infrastructure. There are requirements to manage a species like this, but we believe that there are many opportunities to bring the beaver back to this larger landscape, and that is also part of our thinking. This seems slightly less dramatic, but the juniper tree, this beautiful tree, well known for the production of fruit that's used in the making of gin, this species is a heathland species and used to occur on Ashdown Forest, but does no longer. Nobody is quite sure why it was lost, but intensive grazing by deer may be part of the story. And we will be looking to see how this species and other lost species can be brought back. We've been talking about species, but we also need to think about habitats. This is an image of what I call thicket. Other people call it scrub or shrub. There's very little of this habitat left in our area because it's considered to be untidy and difficult. Farmers have removed it in very, very large areas, and deer the grazing of deer makes it difficult for it to return to those areas or even to Ashdown Forest. But with encouragement, support, and practical engagement, we believe we can bring back extensive areas of thicket. And along with the thicket, we would hope and expect to see the return of totemic bird species such as the nightingale and the turtle dove, which have been in this landscape until quite recently and have been lost due to the loss of this particular habitat. Much of the landscape, particularly that owned and managed by our neighbours, is grassland. Most of it is what is referred to as improved grassland. It's improved for production, meat production, the grazing of cattle, but it's not improved from the perspective of biodiversity. So we would hope to rethink pastures, to manage them in a different way so that they can and will be grazed by livestock. They will be part of a farming system, but they will have much, much greater biodiversity for insects and wildflowers, encouraging birds, and so much more. Wetlands across the world have been drained, and that's including here on Ashdown Forest. Our rivers are turned into canals. Areas like this are not considered to be valuable, but increasingly it's understood they're important for biodiversity. They're important for carbon storage and the production of peat, which helps us with our concerns about climate change. And they're also very important for helping us manage water in a more cost-effective way. Now, this is likely to become more and more important as climate change changes the way that our rains come. And wetlands like this are very important for the storage and cleaning of water. Now, we are fortunate in this part of England to have very significant areas of woodland. We are probably the most wooded part of England, with coverage up to approaching a third. We still have a way to go to reach a third, but a lot of the woodland that we have looks like this. Now, I am a great lover of the silver birch tree, but solid stands of silver birch like this are not very good for nature recovery. They're not very good for biodiversity. And what we would like to do is have more woodlands like this, more open, more diverse, better for biodiversity. To achieve woodlands like this, one of the key things that we need to understand is the impact of fallow deer. Fallow deer in the numbers that they currently exist in the larger landscape, estimated at between 16 and 18 animals per square kilometre, prevent the recovery of nature, prevent the recovery of certain species of tree through their browsing. So they make it difficult to restore high biodiversity value woodland. So the management of this species across the landscape is another of the ways that we will plan to work with our neighbours and manage our landscape together. So let me now talk briefly about access. Access is critical for allowing people to move through our landscape. So we're not only interested in joining up our landscape for biodiversity and species to move, we're also very keen to open access to allow connectivity for people to move through the landscape, to move through it, enjoy it, learn from it, engage with it. This is a picture of one of our partner land managers who already has permissive access across his land. We hope to encourage more of this kind of behavior so that more areas can be accessible to the public. That does not mean we wish that all areas will be accessible to the public. The reason for this is to allow certain species of nature to recover. Areas with limited or low human interference, human presence is necessary. For example, the project to return the pine marten to this landscape will not begin on Ashdown Forest because we have so many people accessing the area the entire time. The project would not succeed on Ashdown Forest. Instead, it will be undertaken on the woodlands, in the woodlands of one of our neighbours, because in those woodlands there is very limited human presence, and the pine marten is more likely to thrive and more likely to recover and spread across the wider landscape. So access is critical, access is important, but it does need to be managed. What kinds of access are we looking for, and why are we looking for it? We're looking to improve engagement with the broader public. Ashdown Forest has a history of engaging. We have education programs. We're an open access area. Many walking groups come here. We try to have presentations and talks and forms of engagement with our neighbours. We would like to do a lot more in this respect, and we would like our neighbours and partners to also be involved in engaging the public in nature recovery and also in elements of farming and the use of the landscape for food production. All of this can provide compelling subjects to engage the public in what goes on in the countryside, more generally around the villages and towns where they live. In addition to this, we are keen to have active participation. Here we see volunteers working on Gravetye Estate, which is also a public access area, creating new habitats for new species. And the images below are to explain that the distribution of nightjars shown in the right-hand picture can be mapped. And the map on the left was put together with the support of volunteers, members of the public coming out onto Ashdown Forest to count and record nightjars to help us map them and estimate their populations. But perhaps the most important way that we can involve the public and the public can be involved in the restoration of nature across our larger landscape is through gardening. Very many of us have gardens, which we love. We don't all garden in such a way that nature is promoted and connected across our gardens and our neighbours' gardens. So we're hoping to work with gardens and gardeners and companies to rethink how gardening in our landscape can contribute to nature restoration. Finally, I would like to indicate that landscapes are not only about species and not only about vistas and not only about the physical terrain. Landscapes are very much a creation, what I call a cultural landscape, and they embody all of the people that have walked across them in the past and wish to walk across them in the future, all those that have worked on them and in them, all of the activities and the institutions and laws and arrangements that relate to how they're owned and accessed. These are all part of the landscape, and our efforts to improve the contiguity and continuity of our landscapes, to have truly joined up management, very much relates to this idea of the human in the landscape. Very briefly, I want to mention James Adler, who's the inspiration of this project, the CEO of Ashdown Forest, just for 2 years, who very tragically, May 2023, passed away. I would also like to mention that those of you who might be interested in purchasing this beautiful book, Through the Seasons, a joint production of James Adler and a local photographer, Craig Payne, please come up to Ashdown Forest and our visitor centre, where you'll be able to purchase this book, contributions of which go towards the management of Ashdown Forest. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this has been interesting. If you have any questions for me, please email me at conservators@ashdownforest.org, and I will do my best to answer your questions. Thank you very much indeed.